I shall never forget the thrill of seeing my name Lucile outside the beautiful old house at 23 Hanover Square. It seemed the embodiment of all my dreams. By this time, my fame had spread, and the square would be lined with carriages every morning and afternoon, while in the discreet little fitting rooms would be women of all ages waiting to consult me. Sometimes I would take a peep at them as they came in, and if I thought they would never be able to do me justice, I would send one of the girls to tell them that Lucile was too busy for any consultations that day. Very often they did not come back, for they had caught a glimpse of my dresses and found them too revolutionary for their liking. It seems so silly, now that we have just got over wearing skirts above our knees and showing our backbone below the waist, to think that those demure little morning dresses and diaphanous tea gowns I made were once considered by many people too daring. But they were. Matchmaking mothers would stare anxiously at their daughters when I had dressed them, and murmur, "Are you quite sure, dear Lady Duff-Gordon, that it does not look too suggestive?" As if there could be anything suggestive in youth and grace and beauty. But in spite of the fact that I dressed royal ladies, and so was smiled on by the immediate court circle, I shocked a great many people, who brought against me the terrible indictment in those days of making stagey clothes. I took it as a compliment, for in those days virtue was too often expressed by dowdiness, and I had no use for the dull, stiff-boned bodice brigade. I had a message for the women I addressed. I was the first dressmaker to bring joy and romance into clothes. I was a pioneer. Incidentally, I made history as far as dressmaking is concerned. The evolution of the mannequin was brought about in my grey salons in Hanover Square. Down the steps into that beautiful room with its gilt chairs and couches brought over from Paris tripped the first of a long line of sylphs, destined to reach down the years and to survive so long as there are dressmakers, and whose purpose it is to lure women into buying more dresses than they can afford. Today you have dress parades in every shop in Paris and London. But when I moved into Hanover Square, a dress parade was a thing unheard of. In those days, one paid a visit to one's dressmaker and was received into the uncompromising atmosphere of a shop with hard chairs, a few unbecoming mirrors, and a door which opened onto a little fitting room. Nobody had thought of developing the social side of choosing clothes, of serving tea and imitating the setting of a drawing room. Trying on or selecting clothes was a thing of as much secrecy as fitting a wooden leg might be expected to be. In many of the then fashionable dressmakers' establishments, the models were displayed on horrid lay figures, dreadful affairs of sawdust and wax faces, calculated to inspire a positive revolt against whatever dress they happened to be attired in. Then, greatly daring, some resourceful soul conceived the idea in Paris of having living models. But there was no parade Oh dear no, nothing so frivolous. Remember, they were fighting prejudice. A good woman had to look good, or her virtue was not to be believed in. There must be nothing which might shock the susceptibilities of the grandes dames who visited the salons. Nothing which might suggest that the poor little mannequin had a personality of her own, that she was capable of any more emotion than the sawdust dummy which she replaced. She must not show the glow of youthful flesh or the curves of young ankles. So, to prevent it, they encased her in a garment of rigid black satin, reaching from chin to feet, which were shod in unappetizing laced boots. Even the most nervous mamma could safely take her son with her to the dressmaker's when temptation appeared in such unalluring guise. That is to say, if it could be called temptation at all, for as a guarantee of the respectability of the establishment, the director could be relied upon to choose only the plainest of girls to show off his creations. I shall never forget being taken to see the models at a famous house in Paris, and the positive shock I felt when I saw lovely evening dresses in pale shades of rose and blue being worn by girls whose arms and necks, in dingy black satin, emerged from the low-cut décolletés. I decided that nothing on earth would induce me to show such atrocities. Slowly, the idea of a mannequin parade, which would be as entertaining to watch as a play, took shape in my mind. I would have glorious, goddess-like girls who would walk to and fro dressed in my models, displaying them to the best advantage to an admiring audience of women. After I had visualized it all, the rest seemed possible, and I set about looking for pretty girls. Not so easy then as it would be now. It was some time before I succeeded in finding my mannequins who would be able to do justice to my dresses. Meanwhile, I gave my whole attention to preparing the setting for this first dress parade. I had a soft, rich carpet laid down in the big showroom, and beautiful grey brocade curtains to tone with it were hung across the windows. At one end of the room I had a stage, a miniature affair, all hung with misty olive chiffon curtains as the background, which created the atmosphere I wanted. Then I sent out the invitations on dainty little cards, keeping the illusion that I was inviting my friends to some afternoon party rather than to a place of business. All my clients were curious to see this new idea of Lucile's, and I do not believe there was one refusal. I realized that on this parade of mine I would stand or fall, and as the day drew near I was terribly anxious. Suppose that it should be a failure, and I should be exposed to the ridicule of those who were jealous of my success so early in life. I pictured the unkind witticisms at my expense, and the biting comments on my ambitious scheme. I was little more than a girl then, and like all young people, I was really very sensitive under my air of extreme self-possession. However, it was no good worrying, for I had gone too far to draw back, and I summoned up all my courage. Meanwhile, I had found my mannequins, 6 of them. Oh, the coaching and the anxious thought I gave them. The hair and the hands were soon set right by sending them to my own hairdressers. That cheered me up, for slowly I saw my chrysalids' wings beginning to appear. Then I set about teaching them to walk as I imagined young goddesses should walk. I used to make them walk up and down the showroom with books on their heads, until they had acquired a perfect poise of head and shoulders. When my 6 had achieved the art of walking beautifully, the battle was won. Feminine psychology did the rest. Is there a woman in the world who will not respond in her own personality to the influence of lovely clothes? I realized that here was a complete metamorphosis. Those 6 simple young girls had become the incarnation of enchanting womanhood. With amused eyes, I watched them develop 100 little airs and graces, watched them copy the peeresses and famous actresses who came into my salons, until it became second nature to them to look and behave like women whose existence had been unknown to them a few short weeks before. At last, the great day of my first parade, the first real mannequin parade ever held, arrived. The showroom was crowded. Princess Alice, the dearest, most human of all my royal patrons, sat near the front. I think she knew I was nervous, for she gave my hand an affectionate little squeeze and told me how she was looking forward to seeing the models. Ellen Terry was there, kind and thoughtful, helping late arrivals to find their places. Lily Langtry, so beautiful that she made everyone turn to look at her as she came in with much more of a regal entry than the several royal ladies who were present. Then there was the Duchess of Westminster and Margot Asquith, young then and rather noisy, but always vivid and amusing, and ever so many more whom I have forgotten. It would be easier, in fact, to say that society was present en masse, at least feminine society, for as yet no man had even thought of visiting such an entertainment. It was many years afterwards that I had my first male visitor to a dress parade, and he was Mr. Asquith, who had accompanied his wife Margot. So in love with her was he, and ready to make her least wish his law. He sat calmly through the show, I remember, though I do not think he gave much attention to the models. But I am digressing. This first parade of mine, in addition to the mannequins, originated another custom which has been in use ever since: the naming of different models. Before that, they were generally referred to as the pink silk, or the black velvet, or even by numbers. It offended my sense of the dramatic that some creation of mine, the expression of a mood, should be spoken of only as number 9, or whatever it might be. So I gave them all names and personalities of their own. How they made my audience smile as they were called out one by one. The Captain with Whiskers. When passion's thrall is over. Give me your heart. Do you love me? Gowns of emotion, I called them, and they caught the fancy of all those women who sat and watched the girls from Balham and Bermondsey, showing them how they ought to walk. I shall never forget the long-drawn breath of admiration that rippled round the room as the curtains parted slowly and the first of my glorious girls stepped out onto the stage, pausing to show herself a moment before floating gracefully down the room to a burst of applause. Who was she? Where had she come from? The questions and conjectures flew from one to the other as the tall figure, 5'11" of loveliness, crowned with a coronet of golden hair, swept along. Her beautiful head was held proud and erect. Her dress clung to her long, slender limbs. Jewels glittered on her neck and arms, for I had plundered my own jewel case and that of my sister, in order that nothing should be wanting in the picture. After her followed 5 others, each, it seemed, lovelier than the last. There was never such a triumph for me as that wonderful afternoon. For hours afterwards, my head rang with the applause and the showers of congratulations which these women, the richest and greatest in the country, lavished on me. Orders flowed in by the dozen, so that the saleswomen could hardly cope with them. My star had risen. I knew that from that moment my career as a dressmaker would be smiled upon by fortune. As for my mannequins, they became famous in 24 hours. The next day, a procession of stage door Johnnies waited for them to come out. I had to send them sternly away. That audience of women had talked to good purpose. There was not one of those 6 first mannequins who could not have made a brilliant marriage then and there. Of course the papers were enthusiastic for the next few days over this novel dress show, and I still have boxes of press cuttings praising Lucile's mysterious beauties, as they called my mannequins. For I, thinking that a little mystery would heighten their attraction, refused to divulge their names, or to say where I had found them. When I arrived in the showroom the morning after the parade, I found a group of reporters waiting to interview me. One of them was not a reporter, but the sub-editor of the Royal Magazine, and he told me his name was Rudolph Bezier. He seemed very cocksure and rather aggressive, but I liked him. I took him round the workrooms and showed him the models. He laughed heartily at the names of some of my gowns of emotion, and was very sceptical over them. "Just imagine this for a name," he read out, "the sighing sound of lips unsatisfied. How in the world could a dress express that?" I insisted that it could, and told the mannequins to put on the different dresses. As they came out onto the stage, I asked him to guess the name of each dress. Of course he could not. Then a girl walked slowly in, wearing a dress of soft grey chiffon, veiling an underdress of shot pink and violet taffeta. It looked rather like an opal, and gave the impression of something shadowed and unreal. "Now, what does that suggest to you?" I asked him. He laughed. "I should say a young widow, or perhaps an old maid. Anyway, something unsatisfied." That's exactly what I thought of when I called the model The sighing sound of lips unsatisfied, I told him. He had to admit there was something to be said for my idea of naming the dresses. He often came to the showrooms after that, and even gave me suggestions for other names for dresses. A frenzied song of amorous things was one of them. I never thought he was quite serious about it, but the model sold splendidly and was one of my most successful. Another scarlet dress he christened Red Mouth of a Venomous Flower, and to a dinner dress of blue and crystal he gave the name The Meaning of Life is Clear. In these days, a mannequin is so much an accepted fact at any fashionable dressmaker's that we are apt to take her for granted. The slender figure gliding in and out of the room, in first one dress, then another, pausing to answer questions about the model she wears in an expressionless voice, has become so familiar that her presence is scarcely noticed, except as a means for displaying the gown. But at the time when I first launched my goddesses, they were the talk of London. Women came as much out of curiosity to see them as out of a wish to buy the clothes I was creating. Within the first 6 months of starting the parades, I had doubled my clientele and nearly trebled my turnover. You see, I knew the value of a picture to women, the subtle allure of atmosphere. Women who would gaze unmoved at my loveliest model when it was offered for their inspection in the cold grey light of a winter morning would come back in the afternoon when a parade was in progress, see it worn by Gamela or Hebe, and buy it immediately. All women make pictures for themselves. They go to the theatre and see themselves as the heroine of the play. They watch Marlene Dietrich or Greta Garbo acting for them at the cinema, but it is themselves they are watching really. And when the lights are lowered to a rosy glow and soft music is played and the mannequins parade, there is not a woman in the audience, though she may be fat and middle-aged, who is not seeing herself looking as those slim, beautiful girls look in the clothes they are offering her. And that is the inevitable prelude to buying the clothes. Very soon I had increased the number of my mannequins, and their fame had spread to such an extent that when it became known I was looking for more girls, I had over 200 applicants to choose from. I gave each one of my mannequins a name in harmony with her personality. There was lovely Gamela, Black Beauty in Arabic. I called her that. Her real name was Susie. It was hopelessly incongruous for her 6'1" of perfect symmetry. Her blue-black hair coiled round her ears in 2 plaits. Gamela was the originator of the telephone coil hairdressing. Her long almond-shaped eyes and straight-cut cameo-like features suggested a priestess of Isis, far back in Egypt. She was the ideal exponent of the exotic oriental evening gowns which I made so popular before the war, and she wore them as though she had been born to the inheritance of riches and power. As she walked down the room, her proud little head held erect, her strange, mysterious eyes half closed. She made most of the women who watched her look insignificant. Then there was Dolores, another goddess, a statuesque 6-foot beauty with a Grecian profile and such lovely limbs that Florence and Hebe, that world's judge of women, came by chance to one of my parades in New York, begged me on the spot to release her, and took her for his follies. For a while she had a triumphant career as the most beautiful girl in the States. Her face was embossed on the American war coins. Then she married Mr. Tudor Wilkinson, millionaire and art collector, who took her to live in his wonderful appartement in Paris on the Quai d'Orléans. Phyllis was a chubby, baby-faced type with a rosebud mouth. She looked so feminine and helpless that any man who saw her felt he simply had to protect her from the cruel world. Mr. Jesse Franks, who was called the Wall Street Wizard, felt it so ardently when he met her on the boat going out with me to New York that he persuaded her to marry him, and I lost one of my best mannequins. Now, Phyllis is one of the richest women in London. Florence, who had skin like a flower and beautiful hands and tiny feet, married into one of the oldest families in Scotland and was presented at court. Hebe, loveliest of them all, became a legend in Paris and had so many suitors that she could have married a dozen times over. Hebe was dark and very demure and sphinx-like, with her quiet, downcast eyes and oval face. Her father was a teacher of French at Greenwich, and she had intended to follow in his footsteps. Then someone told her that I wanted a mannequin who could speak French to take over to Paris with me, and she came to the showrooms to apply for the post. She got it, and went with me not only to Paris, where her beauty caused a sensation, but to America. Then she married Mr. Arthur Kingsland, the multi-millionaire, and went to live in his chateau outside Pau. These were the girls who might, in the ordinary course of events, have had lives of obscurity. I used to tell them I liked travelling with them, for their beauty was an open sesame to all doors. The susceptible Frenchmen at customs never even examined our luggage. They looked at Hebe's face instead and passed us through. And in the restaurants, waiters used to hover obsequiously round our table. I think they would have chosen one of the rare smiles that Dolores used to dispense, rather than the most generous tip. They used to bring the best of everything that was on the menu for us. Swept along on the tide of triumph created by those first mannequin parades of mine, they became world famous. In London, in Paris, in New York, and in Chicago, they had some of the richest men of the day at their feet. They stood for beauty incarnate. Suitors clamoured for their favours. When they walked in the Avenue des Champs-Élysées or lunched at Voisins, they were surrounded by a crowd of admirers who hovered at a respectable distance. There was nothing that they might not have asked from men. So great was the power of the legend they had become.